You know I want it. Come pretend I never left you. You know I'll be lying. How can something become nothing? Or has this just become something else? Now we're something else. Ooh, I'm trying to live my life without you. You know I want. Come pretend I never left you. You know I'll be lying. How can something become nothing? Or has this just become something else? Now we're something else.
A love so rare. Can you feel it? It's so high. It's so right. It's so right. A love so rare. Can you feel it? It's so high. A love so rare. Can you feel it? It's so high. It's so right. It's so right. A love so rare. Can you feel it? It's so high. It's so right. It's so right. It's so high. Can you feel it? It's so high. It's so right. It's so right. A love so rare. Can you feel it? It's so high. It's so high. It's so high. It's so right. It's so right. It's so right. A love so rare. Can you feel it? It's so high. It's so.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's panel. I will kindly ask our panel to reveal themselves and activate their videos. They're all waiting in the background. Let me invite them in. So today is Sharon and Steve and Lee. So Mark, we're just waiting on Mark.
It's telling me that I can't activate my video for some reason. It says the host.
I just sent him an invite. Okay. Well, while we're waiting for Mark to reveal himself, let's start with today's session. As you know, we will be talking about net zero carbon buildings. And we decided to focus on schools because as they are funded by the government, and this is a government strategic goal to reach net zero carbon buildings by 2050, it makes total sense to focus on the buildings they are paying for themselves. So we are thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for Lee from Shepard Robson, who kindly helped us put this together, and is such a high caliber of speakers that we are very, very excited to have this chat with you all this morning. So with us today is Lee Bennett, partner at Shepard Robson. Lee pioneered low-embodied energy building at the practice with many schools and higher education projects designed in mass timber. He also teaches at Liverpool University and is an external examiner at the AA. Also with us this morning is Sharon Wright, Senior Associate at the Learning Crowd. Sharon specializes in education capital projects and has a particular expertise in strategy and brief development, options appraisal, and stakeholder engagement. Over the past 18 years, she has worked with education leaders, architects, and contractors to create the best possible learning environment on a wide range of projects nationally and internationally. Mark Skelly, the third panelist today, is director and founder at Skelly & Couch Limited. Mark is founding and managing director of building services consultant Skelly & Couch. Whilst classed as M&E engineer, Mark has a keen interest in building physics, the built environment, environmental psychology, and building envelopes. Over a 20-year career, he has gathered a broad range of experience in both the public and private and education sector. Last but not least is Dr. Stephen Finnegan, Zero Carbon Research Institute and lecturer at the Liverpool University School of Architecture. Stephen acts as a director of the Zero Carbon Research Institute, working with the industry to have the UK government achieve its goal of developing net zero carbon buildings by 2050. In addition, he is a lecturer in sustainable architecture, leading on NZC design. His research investigates the whole life sustainability and financial aspects of sustainable buildings. So good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning. I would like to kick off this session with a short overview that maybe Lee, you could help us with this one. Short overview of what's the current situation while we're waiting for our fantastic spectators to kick in the first questions.
Yeah, thank you. Is it possible, Sarah, to share my screen? Could I
yeah, you should be able to. Let me check. Right, I need to find this. Is the system telling you you can't?
Here we go.
Oh, I'll stop mine. Hold on. You should be able to do it now.
Yeah, can everyone see this?
Not yet.
Let me know if you can.
Oh, you go. It's kicking on. It's perfect.
Thank you. I've just got a few slides, Sarah, to kind of kick us off, really. And thank you very much. And yeah, net zero design and the challenge around schools. And the first slide, which is one we don't really need to put up anymore, I suppose, which is the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that maps directly, basically, onto the Industrial Revolution. It's a fact. And we have a global responsibility. You mentioned the 2050 net zero carbon emissions. We have a responsibility because globally construction accounts for circa 20% of carbon emissions, but actually in the developed world and in the UK, it accounts for 40. So it's even more important that we take on this challenge because our global responsibility is higher in terms of the proportional contribution. I put down a list of what the challenges are really and kind of talking points we might discuss today. And the question is whether schools, in terms of a large building programme for the UK, can lead the charge in that for the whole, or representing the whole of the construction industry in a way. There are many, the first point is there are many, for instance, for RBA 2030 Climate Challenge, the Government Challenge of 2050, Architects Declare. There are many of those declarations, none of which combine the embodied carbon and carbon emissions in use. So in essence, what I'm saying is we don't have a joined up policy. The other thing we should probably talk about is the retrofit first idea, and would that be an adoptable policy? I mean, the greenest building that they say is the one that's already existing. So we should really take that challenge on. When we're building new though, is timber the answer, and what are the challenges around that? I've got a lot of experience in that, I believe it is. And then onto the quality of the learning environment and the benefits of, for instance, mass timber, notions of wellness and biophilia around teaching spaces. That leads us on to the policy actually adopted by the General Teaching Council in Scotland, which is a learning for sustainability idea for the curriculum, in that sustainability is embedded actually in the curriculum as part of the learning process. And finally, onto MMC, Modern Methods of Construction, which is hoping to deliver the majority of the new state school building programme. I've got a few images to kind of spice it up, Sarah. Just take a couple of minutes to crack through these. First one is, as we move away from high energy loads in buildings and towards low energy buildings, hopefully in use, that material emissions become much more important. So the proportion of the embedded carbon is much more interesting to look at when we consider the whole carbon emissions of the building. Operational emissions are less. We're hopefully producing much more energy efficient buildings under passive house and so on and so forth. So the material that we construct the building of becomes more and more important. I believe that timber is the answer, of course, when we're building new. It's carbon negative. It looks fantastic. There's minimal waste. You can build very, very close to existing buildings and existing classrooms when you use timber. It's super clean, super quiet. And here are some examples of that. Wangel School in Wokingham. Timber, timber everywhere. And then the most recent one, which is East London Science School in the East End, near West Ham. The other point to make is that when we're building in timber, I seem to be promoting timber quite a lot here, but anyway, timber is incredibly good for kids in classrooms, and this was a research, some research done at the Onium Institute in Graz, which compared a classroom basically of plasterboard, the typical classroom, against the classroom of timber, which had huge benefits across achievement, reducing stress, student aggressiveness, and so on and so forth. So I believe that also timber has positive educational benefit. So this is a slide that just catches the Learning for Sustainability policy that's the General Teaching Council of Scotland have adopted, which, as I said earlier, is to embed sustainability in the curriculum, a project that all faculties can congregate around. So, modern methods of construction, we're working on this, on the new framework between 2020 to 25. Which is targeting 70% of off-site construction. And our point here is, when we're doing that, we should be building as much as possible in timber, less waste, low carbon, quicker build, better quality, hopefully. And here's a couple of diagrams from our recent work on that, just to prove the point. So we end up with a manifesto, okay, which is my sort of 5-point plan for an improved sustainable legacy, not just in schools, but also these points are applicable to the whole of the construction industry and our output. Retain and revive, retrofit first. We all can buy into that, I think. Fabric first. Can we adopt a timber first strategy? 2. I believe that MMC should be incentivizing timber when we work in modern methods of construction. We should be looking at using timber there as much as possible. We should be considering well-being generally, students particularly, and whole life value, which maybe Sharon could talk about later. And then the pedagogy in a school. What we learn in school is we learn for life. And I think if we're going to sustain life on this planet in any decent way, we should be learning for sustainability basically under a STEAM program. That's it. Thank you.
Lee, thank you very much for that. So while we wait for the audience to ask their own questions, we'll start with Steve, please, and let's start from the basics. Can you talk to us, explain to us why carbon literacy, why zero carbon is so important, and actually what does it mean?
Hi, Sarah. Thank you for the question. It's a pleasure to be here today with the other panelists, and welcome everyone who's joined us. There's a large debate at the moment around this topic, hence why we have 115 people on this call. There's a massive push for net zero carbon. There's been city councils across the UK, probably the vast majority now, who have declared carbon neutrality. We've got businesses like Apple, Google, Nike, everybody jumping on this net zero carbon bandwagon. But what does it actually mean? And that's what I'm really interested in as a sort of researcher and a practitioner at the university. So I'm currently working and at present and have been working with over 30 or 40 different types of clients and businesses who are all asking the same question. So we've been given some guidance from the likes of the World Green Building Council, the UK Green Building Council, the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, HM Government, the LETI guidance. There's lots and lots of things out there, but what does it all mean? And I call that sort of carbon sort of literacy. We all need to understand what it means and how we need to get there. The biggest elephant in the room with all of this, of course, is money and what it costs to achieve to that status. So just very briefly, net zero carbon, we need to look at this in terms of 2 distinct areas, as Lee's quite rightly mentioned in his previous talk. We need to look at net zero carbon in operation, so how we heat, power, cool a building, and we need to look at net zero carbon in construction. Now we do have targets, as Lee's mentioned as well. So we have, for all of our new buildings, by 2030 we need to be what we call net zero carbon in operation, and then by 2050 every building needs to be net zero in operation by that year. So what does that actually mean? Well, in essence, it means that the power and the energy that we use in our building must be sourced from 3 different ways. It must be sourced on site, or it must be purchased renewably from off-site, or as a last resort, we are allowed to carbon offset. So they're the 3 ways in which we can get to operational net zero carbon by 2030 and 2050. The other big area to look at is the embodied carbon as well. So this, when we say embodied carbon, what I'm referring to is the whole life impact of products, materials, the raw materials, transportation, manufacture, assembly, end of life. And the targets at present are that for new buildings, we need a 40% reduction in embodied carbon by 2030, based on 2020 baseline. And for new buildings in 2050, we have to have a 100% reduction in embodied carbon. So I'll finish there on that point. That will hopefully stimulate a lot of debate. You know, how on earth are we going to get there? What are the cost implications? And if I had the answer, I could tell you, but we don't. So there's still a long way to go. You know, we've got 10 years to reach that interim target, 30 years to reach the net zero carbon target. Government policy will change, more guidance will come through, but we're just at the start of that journey.
Thank you very much, Steve.
I think, is it worth me just chipping in? I mean, I think Steve's definitely right that cost is a major issue, but I mean, one of the things about carbon literacy I think is important is our lifestyle. You know, we have to look at how we live our lives and how much energy we consume as a society as well. And I think young people are honing into that much more so than maybe our generation, if I may say. So, you know, do we need to fly as much? Do we need to buy washing machines that break after 3 years? You know, all these sorts of things are, you know, really important. I think the lockdown has certainly helped focus people's minds on what they need to do and what they don't need to do in terms of consumerism and travel particularly. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next couple of years after lockdown.
Thank you, Mark. As very rightly pointed out, actually the younger generation is the one that seems to be more interested in climate change, which is absolutely amazing. So Sharon, how do you think this zero carbon policy will improve and affect the school system?
So I think there's a number of things that a real potential to make a difference. And over the last 6 months, I think I've talked about health and well-being in schools more than I have done in the past kind of 18 years, because the pandemic has really focused an understanding on, you know, we need to be better at thinking about how we create spaces and places for people, and education is one of those. Our schools are so important as, you know, community hubs, as workplaces, you know, staff in schools in large numbers, and for our young people and their learning. And I think you know, one of the benefits of having this conversation is that we're talking about health and well-being. It was on Lee's slides, for example. What is going to create better environments for our young people, our staff in schools and our communities? And I think we need to tap into this interest that young people have. I mean, they are clamoring for more involvement. You know, there's quite a lot of activism going around. There's initiatives from young people like Teach the Future, and you know, they're really starting to kind of make their voices heard. And we need to tap into that, and we need to be partnering with young people in these discussions about how they can help and influence what's going on. Because we need them to be interested in these things. You know, I don't know if you heard the Prime Minister's skills speech in September, but again, the pandemic has raised the fact that we need young people who are going to be interested and, you know, take forward careers in science, technology, engineering and maths. And this is one wonderful way to engage them in those conversations, get them excited about how they can influence, how they can work on real world problems, you know, to come up with solutions. But on the cautionary side, I would say that it's not enough to just innovate and put buildings down and expect the users to then fully understand how to operate them over like 25, 30 years without, again, partnering with them so that they fully understand the benefits of what they're getting. And just to finish, as an example, I was chair of governors of a new primary school, beautiful, concrete, amazing. We were promised that our energy bills would go down massively. First energy bills we got 6 months later were much higher than they'd previously been in an old building, because apparently there was a hole somewhere in the ground source heat pump and we didn't know. So we didn't actually know how to manage the building that we'd been given, which was fantastic in lots of ways. But, you know, I think there is that kind of, how do we partner with education to help them to be able to fulfill the potential of these developments that are going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Lee, there is a question for you already here. You were talking about the timber and how what an amazing material it is, and it would increase benefits from a zero carbon perspective, but also mental well-being and everything like that. Alison is asking really interesting questions about timber and the effects on students. Do the results only apply to actual timber, or do timber effects like laminates, wood effect, tiles, etc., have the same impact?
Well, that's it's a very good question, and I don't know the answer. I think the example I gave, the study that was done was basically in a mass timber classroom. So it was CLT, cross laminated timber, which also, I mean, if you go into any of the skills that we've done in timber, and we've done quite a lot, it's not just the visual aspect of it and the warmth of the wood there, but it's olfactory. There's a smell, you know. It gives there's a whole kind of ambience to timber, and the human being's relationship with cellulose and wood is absolutely amazing. And I think it's probably a combination of all of those factors: the warmth of it, the look of it, the smell of it. Combined. So an artificial timber maybe has some benefits, possibly, but not as much as, of course, the real thing.
And another question about timber as well. Melissa is asking, from your experience, how is the use of timber, both structurally and as an internal finish, overcoming challenges such as fire performance? Aware there are some fire retardant treatments to timber linings. Do these deviate from the findings from the Dranenum Research Institute in Graz?
When we're building schools under 18 meters, the fire issue isn't huge, but there's the perception of fire as an issue around timber is massive. We had a fire actually in one of our buildings in Manchester, the pavilion built in timber, a year ago. It was all over the press. It was put out fairly rapidly, but timber in that instance performed incredibly well. And it does. Structurally, it protects itself. It's amazing. It chars, as Mark says, it chars, and it's as stable, if not more stable, than steel comparatively. I get the nervousness about timber. I completely understand with Grenfell and all of that. That's absolutely completely valid. But we can use timber safely, is the point.
Yeah, I think this is a worry. This is one of my worries at the moment about the push towards timber. Is the industry needs to come up to speed on the technicalities of designing in timber, because as Lee says, you know, all the buildings that we've done together and that he's done, and certainly that our practice have done, the timber is exposed. But I think I see a lot of timber buildings going up which are driven by this idea of timber replacing concrete or steel, and then the timber is covered with plasterboard, and actually the embodied energy of all of that, which is driven by acoustics and fire and all these sort of things, that actually, if you had a bit longer to work through the detail, you can resolve without so many materials. Try and use less materials, you know, is equally as important as trying to use a sustainable material like timber. You know, there's no point designing a building out of timber and then cladding it with loads of high embodied energy materials. So I think that's really important, and it is important to understand the limitations of timber. There are obviously, the other one to add is overheating and climate change. You know, we need to test buildings on future climate scenarios, 2050, 2080, and timber does struggle. I mean, we are looking at a climate akin to the south of France. You don't see many timber schools in the south of France. So, you know, but it is achievable. It's just you have to design in a different way, and you have to think about volume and air movement much more than you do in a concrete or steel building. But out of all the buildings types, you know, schools are very well suited to timber, much less so than tall residential towers, which a lot of people are pushing at the moment. So, you know, I think it's something that we need to look at very carefully over the next couple of years as an industry.
Thank you very much. Steve, I will go back to you now. If we're talking about a new building, so we start from scratch, what criteria do we need to keep in mind to make sure we follow the zero carbon policy?
Hi, Sarah. Sorry about that. Yeah, so we simply go back to the 2 areas I mentioned earlier. You know, looking at the operation and looking at the embodied carbon impact. Now, it's universally recognised, universally known that we take what's called a fabric first approach, and everything that Mark and Lee and Sharon have mentioned so far about insulating the building well, blah blah blah. That's all well and good. So we need to reduce the need for energy in the first place when we're looking at the operational impact. And then we need to look at how we source that energy. There was a big push recently, again, another government announcement, that we want all new buildings to be 100% electric by 2025. 2021 is very soon. 2025 is just around the corner. And there was something in the press last week that said now we're not going to be able to achieve that standard. So there's a lot of work being done around how we source energy, what we do, how we use it. So there's that side of things to think about when we design in the operational carbon footprint. And then for the embodied side of things, it's Mark and Lee again referred to it earlier. It's about the materials we use and looking at the whole life cycle impact. Now, this isn't anything new. Whole life cycle impact studies, you know, I completed my sort of PhD on this subject back in 2000. It's nothing new really. It's just grown in interest. So what is essential, and just to finish on this point, is EPDs, environmental product declarations. So we will move to a position where we have an EPD for every single product that we use on site. And that's starting, so then we can measure the effectiveness and the performance of all of our materials in the very near future.
Thank you. And Mark, since we're talking about the future, how do we make sure these buildings, obviously we're now talking about retrofitting existing buildings to make sure they adapt to the new requirements, but how do we make sure the buildings that we're building now can stand the test of the future?
Yeah, I mean that's the challenge. I think there's no doubt that in the large parts of the industry, buildings have become a consumable product where we've been building buildings for capital, particularly in residential and commercial sectors, and that has sort of spilled over a little bit to education buildings, big education framework projects. But also, you know, people who are building buildings trying to do them as cheaply as possible and not looking at capital costs rather than life cycle costs. And I think there is a realization in the industry now that, you know, the Construction Industry Hub have just released a new value framework, which tries to pull the decision makers away from looking at just capital. You know, it's based on 5 pillars, which are to do with natural, social, human, manufactured, as well as financial products. So I think there is a realization, and you know, you see things like Grenfell obviously is big news at the moment, and what's gone on there, and some of the you know, some of the things that are coming out are, you know, shocking, but at the same time, I think some of us in the industry had a suspicion a lot of this sort of stuff was happening. So it is a change of mindset, and it is about building really good buildings, making sure that a building is designed well. You know, if you look at a Victorian building, generally a lot of those buildings are still around and they've been adapted. You know, if they started as a school, say a London Board Victorian school, it's, you know, it's still standing, but it's been used for something else, either residential or offices, or, you know, so there's lots of examples, and we've probably gone away from, you know, if we look at a lot of buildings we've built in the last 30 years, how many of them can we say we can adapt that to another use? You know, it's not that many. So I think we need to start thinking about buildings as a product which needs to stay, and the more embodied energy we put in that product, the more it's got to be flexible and adaptable. So I always say to I mean, if you look at our website, there's lots of timber buildings. They all look fantastic. Everyone thinks that I would promote timber for everything, but you know, actually, we do stuff in concrete as well. And what I say to the architects is, building in concrete is like drawing with a permanent marker. You know, you draw with a permanent marker, and you can't rub it out. So every stroke of the pen has to be really carefully thought through. Whereas building in timber is a bit like drawing in pencil. You can rub it out, not too many times because the picture comes a bit messy. But you know, so really what you want is you can have a structure that's built in permanent marker and everything else around it is in pencil, and you can rub it out as long as that permanent marker is able to be adapted and changed. And that's the way we need to think about buildings, really.
So it's maybe I could talk a little bit about the schools that we did in Liverpool. We did a sequence of schools under Liverpool's own school programme. They went the independent route, and we built schools with a brief that was, what happens if the school is no longer needed? We were working to a very long design life. So we worked with basically a school in a shed, if you like, if I can term it as crudely as that. And we repeated this 3 times or more actually across the city, which was basically to provide a completely unencumbered plan, a clear span with classrooms around the perimeter and a face, one of the faces open to the play space and green space beyond, in very difficult areas in Liverpool, by the way, too. And the idea was that, and the sustainability aspect of this is that, as Mark says, that the longer a building can function and change its function over those years, the more sustainable and the less throwaway we become. And that was a building actually in a hybrid of steel and glulam, which, if you can forgive the leader of the council at the moment, his idea was that it may be a school for 30 years, but it may be an ice rink. It could be a warehouse. It could even be converted into housing. It was as flexible as that, and a very, very successful program that should have been repeated really across. We could have envisaged this system, which had a very sound, by the way, educational basis too, should have been repeated nationally in our view, but wasn't. There's still time.
Thank you very much, Lee. That's really interesting. I can see this is a very hot topic because we never had so many questions from the audience before. So Steve, I need to go back to you for a moment. I've got 2 questions from John Williams and Tariq Mukadam. They're asking about EPD. John is asking, when looking at the EPD, what is the key measurement to look for, and what is a typical good score and a bad score? While Tariq is asking, what is the difference between EPD and HPD?
Okay, just on that first question, that is actually opening up quite a bit of debate. EPDs at the moment, there is a European body that oversees the creation and production and verification of EPDs. However, people who use them are allowed to, it's called a system boundary. So they are allowed to say what is in and out of scope. So one particular client who creates, for example, a certain type of roof structure may include or exclude certain parts of their supply chain, somebody else. So it's not very consistent, and we can't at the moment fully compare one EPD to another. So that's a problem within the system. So in terms of a good or bad score, can't really answer the question. There's not enough EPDs that are being created at the moment to give that benchmark value, and especially for something like timber, it's all over the place, to be honest. So we're just starting on this process. There's a lot of work to be done. Second question, HPD. I've got no idea what that acronym stands for. so I can't answer the question.
Fair enough. Thank you very much for that. Sharon, obviously the UK is a very rich and big country, and we know there is the devolved administrations are doing different things when it comes to zero carbon policy and schools and everything like that. What's the situation at the moment? Who's doing best and who's doing worse?
Oh, you'll be getting me into trouble with a question like that. I think everybody's doing something, and that's interesting. So the Department for Education in England are looking at what they're calling Gen Zero. And I think a lot of us are working with them on that at the minute. And that's about creating a new design guide for all Department for Education procured schools, which sets the standard for new school buildings with the aim of making them net zero. And it's about developing prototypes to, as Lee said, more efficient manufacture and the like. And that's part of a wider government initiative towards 2050. In Wales, there is a real drive towards zero carbon. I think there's and colleagues who are on this call, if they're from Wales and Scotland, might want to tell us more. But I think there's a real kind of Team Wales approach to all public buildings across Wales. And we're doing some work in Wales with schools and thinking about zero carbon at the heart of that. And in Scotland, I think the Scottish Futures Trust, again, kind of overseeing some infrastructure projects, are taking a wide view. I think the one thing I would say, and I might just pick up on what Lee said about his Liverpool schools as well. I think the Liverpool schools are fantastic examples, really good and educationally driven solutions. What I would say is, and I would say this obviously, is that you cannot compromise the education to deliver buildings which might have a different use in 30 years, 25, 30 years time. And I think that's a really interesting balance when you're thinking about some of these issues. But the other just really important thing I think about Scotland and Wales particularly is, so in Scotland, the curriculum which covers 13 to 18-year-olds is called the Curriculum for Excellence, and it has 4 core purposes. That every young people should be a successful learner, a confident individual, a responsible citizen, and an effective contributor. And in Wales, they're bringing in a new curriculum in 2022, which has similar kind of strapline purposes, 4 purposes, one of which is ethical, informed citizens of Wales and the world. And I think in a way, having that narrative around what you want your education to deliver for your young people, including responsible, informed, outward-looking citizens, enables you to have these conversations more easily within the curriculum, because young people, again, are getting engaged in how they're going to influence their future. And I think in England, we don't really have that in the same way. We have quite an exam-driven curriculum, which means that we're trying to kind of shoehorn things like sustainability into an existing exam-based curriculum. So I'm very impressed with Scotland and Wales with this kind of high-level view of what education should be doing for their young people in terms of making them good contributors to society.
Thank you very much. Lee, we go back to talk about materials and finishes with Alison again. More looking into interior finishes, how do we decide which materials to specify? Post-consumer waste versus renewable resources. For example, post-consumer recycled polyester versus wool, a recycled versus longevity argument for a net zero fit out.
Well, I mean, this actually goes back to what Steve was saying in a way, in that a classroom is quite a technical challenge in itself. For everything from the acoustics need to be right, the lighting levels need to be right, the textures need to be right, the surfaces need to be right. There's a whole kind of set of go-to products actually you can that are ratified, safe to use, and the industry knows, and that they're kind of a safer bet, if you like. When we're thinking about using, recycled material, novel material, or even timber, actually, there's always a challenge using timber. There's a barrier. And there's a barrier, and this actually talks to what Mark was saying in terms of the time we've got to design things. We haven't often got time, especially on state schools, to explore and prove alternatives. And I think that's one of the key kind of barriers, assuming, you know, the product is safe and that the EPDs meet their, you know, targets. It's actually about having enough time to generate something that's novel and new and likely more sustainable. I think that's the issue really for us as designers.
And also there's this perception of risk in the supply chain. So I'll give you an example. Clay plaster is a very good product environmentally, both in terms of the way it absorbs moisture, effectively breathes. It's low embodied energy. It's robust. You know, there's listed buildings that have had clay plaster on their walls for hundreds of years, but it's very difficult to get a builder to put it in a building because it's there's not much supply chain. There's risk of it cracking in the first instance, and they don't want to come back and repair it, and all these sort of things. So, you know, there are products out there that historically have been used in buildings before modern materials, which actually are proven materials, but the skill set and the supply chain to actually implement them isn't there at the moment. And actually, you know, perhaps going forward, maybe those are the areas where we need to grow our UK economy and our skill set, you know, reinventing a lot of materials that are available freely in this country.
Well, we're talking about supply chain and materials available. Luke is asking, as trees are the carbon sponges in the world and across the globe, we are decimating our forest. What is the actual carbon savings of using these reserves, including the growth, harvesting, and transportation? Have this been assessed against other more traditional construction techniques?
Well, so I could probably chip in there, Sarah, again. That sort of comes back again to sort of life cycle assessment modeling. Now, there's been a lot of work. There's a lot of tools available to look at, things like Gabi, SEMA Pro, OneClick, LCA. There's databases such as EcoInvent and lots of others. So the answers are there, but it's difficult to get hold of the actual answer you need. There's carbon locked into trees through carbon sequestration. So if you build out of timber, for example, it's, you know, locked in carbon. It's a difficult thing to answer because there's so many sort of variables involved and so many things to think about. So unfortunately, it's not a straightforward question, and that leaves a problem for us all, is that it needs to be simple and it needs to be a straightforward answer. And I think if you asked everyone on the panel today, you know, the people, you will get different answers to that question.
It has to come from a sustainable source. That's the main thing. I mean, a lot of the forest is in forests where a lot of this timber comes from in Finland and Austria. They have effectively a sustainable rotation, you know, planting strategy so that it doesn't affect, you know, the carbon sequestration long term. If it's not sustainable and you start eating away at all the forests, as we did in the UK. I mean, we were a forest of oaks back in sort of early history, and a lot of those oaks were chopped down for building warships and various other things, and housing. So it does need to be sustainable. And at the moment, I think we're only plugging, I think it's 30 or 40% of Europe's sustainable wood resource. So there is room to grow, but there isn't enough wood in Europe to grow everything, to build everything out of timber.
Yeah, and particularly there's not in the UK. We don't really have an industry that can supply well enough the demand for timber. The other thing is the school that we showed earlier, which Sharon and Mark know very well, Angel School, used something like 7,000 trees in its build. And when you say that to people, you say, oh, it took 7. There's shock, especially if you're talking to kids about it, actually. But cellulose is extremely quick to grow, and we proved that the amount of timber that it took to build the school grew back in a day in terms of the volume of timber in that managed forest in Finland. So that perception is an easy one to get around, I think, and it's from managed resources.
Lee, you spoken earlier on at the beginning of some of the main topics that we wanted to cover in this talk this morning, and you mentioned the modern methods of construction. So let's go back to that for a minute. And how do you think MMC can help minimize waste and create a greener and more sustainable solution?
Well, the first point is actually when we're thinking about the state school program. We have to, I guess, unfortunately, think about something that can be repeated on several sites. So there's a kind of model that we can use that can be adapted. And so what we've developed is a modular system, and the modular system we're promoting, which is the most sustainable, of course, is a modular timber system using mass timber, using CLT. And there's a variant of that which is volumetric. And when all of this is done in a factory, there's, first of all, low embodied carbon in the material we're using. There's less waste, which is super important. There's less time on site. There's less disruption and moving around when we work in cheap agile within existing skills, so that we're minimizing that disruption too. And the aim is that as we're going forward is that 60% of the new school build stock will be done under MMC, and it's only really sustainable if we believe if we go down a largely timber route there, because we can solve the energy in use issue fairly easily with well insulated and airtight buildings with minimal energy input. We need to be thinking harder about the material that the building constitutes the building, the base material of the building, which accounts for at least half of its emissions over its life. So that's MMC / timber, if you think about it that way.
Okay, cool, fantastic. Thank you, Lee. Steve, we got clarification about what HPD is from Ian and Tariq. So HPD is the Earth Product Declaration. And Tariq is saying that a few products currently list there as HPDs, but he's not entirely sure what's the difference with EPD. I don't.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So an environmental product declaration mainly measures the carbon dioxide and associated greenhouse gas emissions. So it will measure other things such as eutrophication, acidification potential, abiotic depletion potential. So they don't measure health indicators as such. They measure greenhouse gas related emissions. So there's not really a link between EPDs and HPDs in that context.
Fantastic, that clears that out. And then Sharon, we got Matthew here that is complimenting it's complimenting the whole panel, but specifically your answers to our questions. He says, thank you for this important webinar, and particularly Sharon's comments regarding tying in how the building in which pupils are studying should be part of the curriculum and their education. So one of the questions we discussed earlier on was, what is the important element to include in the brief for a new building so that the users, both students and teachers, can actually benefit from it and flourish?
So it's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, we've been doing some thinking over the summer and autumn about, the fact that briefs tend, especially in England, we start the briefing process with how many classrooms do you need and how many science labs do you need? But actually, if we turned it around and said the brief needs to start from the point of every child and every member of staff needs to flourish in this building, what would that look like? And I've been very struck again over the last 6 months that we've been talking more about the importance of outside spaces. And young people especially will always say, you know, we want to be outside more, we want to do more learning outside. But we have been seriously underfunding external school spaces for quite a while. And the kind of interest in things like biophilic design, the relationship between inside and outside, and again, you know, with timber, effectively, you're bringing the outside in. It's a really lovely way to kind of make that connection. So thinking more about that relationship, how you can use outside spaces for curriculum learning, linking it in to things like, you know, growing food and having conversations about, you know, the impact that supply chain on things like food, Brexit notwithstanding, may have, you know. So again, encouraging young people to think about real world problems through their environment. I think as well, the other thing is we've been thinking about the relationship that schools have to the rest of their community. And at the minute, you know, we tend to think of schools as buildings on their own behind a fence that, you know, are very secure and for lots of good reasons. You can't just wander in. But also, you know, I think if schools are going to be part of their wider context and sustainability and our thinking about it is to be more joined up, then we need to kind of have a bigger view. So talking about sustainable transport around schools, bringing community in so that they're getting the benefit of, you know, what their young people are also experiencing, making better connections between schools and, you know, other interesting initiatives within the community. And schools are wonderful community hubs, and we could use them more, I think, for making those connections as we're creating new ones, especially.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It kind of ties in with the last panel discussion we had before this one with Paige and Parr, that we're discussing exactly as what you just said about how to bring the outdoors in and the indoors out in schools and biophilia and all the benefits of that concept. So Claire, Sharon, staying with you, I've got a question from Claire. We were talking about devolved administrations earlier on. She's asking if you know anything about what's happening in Northern Ireland.
You'd think I would, wouldn't you, coming from Northern Ireland originally? I haven't been working in Northern Ireland for a while, so I'm not up to speed. And I think things may have been slower there because the devolved government was in hiatus for quite a while. But it's on my list, and I'm going to go away and check and find out. But if anyone knows and wants to tell me, I'd be delighted to know if there are initiatives in Northern Ireland that would be useful to consider as well.
Fantastic. Sorry, I've mistakenly muted myself. Let's go back to, I saw a question that was here. Laura is asking, the question of performance gap and POE was mentioned earlier. How can the data gathering process be improved and then learn from in terms of the design team and developer builder engagement post handover? Mark, maybe this one is for you, or Steve?
Yeah, I can make a few comments. I think the POE, post-occupancy evaluation, is absolutely critical. There is not enough information out there. There's organisations such as CIBSE, the Chartered Institute of Building Services Engineers. They do some work in POE. You know, there's lots of other people involved, but it's absolutely critical. We need that design feedback from the operation. And the performance gap is huge. You know, some studies are quoting a difference of up to 40% in performance compared to how a manufacturer says a system will work compared to how it actually does work. And a classic example of that is what Sharon mentioned earlier about the, I think it was a ground source heat pump, Sharon, not too sure, yeah. You know, dropping problems, efficiencies, things like that. And that, again, going back to Lee's point, makes people anxious, makes people nervous. You know, if you fit a gas boiler, it will operate in this way. If you do new things, there's a potential risk, and it's about the attitude to risk, in my opinion.
Thank you. I would stay on this topic with one of the questions we had pre-arranged. Steve, what's wrong with the current guidelines for the design and greener buildings, and how can we make them more attractive? Which also I think answers a few of the questions from our audience.
Yeah, so I think just to be brief on this point, I think the guidelines are improving. If we again go back to looking at operational against embodied carbon, for operational carbon, we do have new guidance such as the London Energy Transformation Initiative, the LETI guidance, the RACS, the UK Green Building Council. We now have sort of benchmarks, energy use indicators. You know, they've gone a long way to help to think about preliminary design, and so that's good. For the embodied carbon thing, we are way behind. So the UK Green Building Council, through its own admission, requires through planning to look at embodied carbon, but only for part of the building. So for example, there's no requirements at present to look at FFE and to look at M&E as part of a building design. So that's a fundamental flaw through their own admission. So things will change in the future. And really, we should be looking at the whole life of buildings as they operate over a 60, 80, 100-year period, and every single component that goes in to get that fully transparent picture. So that's what needs to happen, and that's what will happen over the next 5 years.
Thank you. I think this question is for you, Lee. Maybe Mark can chip in as well. Tariq is asking, should a carbon costing be included at the start of any new project? Would it deter clients in seeing the viability of a project on a cost-driven analysis? Lee, maybe you can start. Yeah. Mark?
Yeah, the answer is yes, there should be. I mean, it's kind of fundamental now, you know, as we sort of sense the issue is incredible. It's important. Everyone understands the issue, and so we should change the way we think, and that should be the initial kind of point. That should be the starting point, actually, of every project, I think. Mark?
Yeah, I mean, well, the problem is at the moment energy is cheap in reality, and we can't make it too expensive because of fuel poverty, etc. And so when you do payback analysis, paybacks are quite often quite long. So it disincentivizes some people, but actually we need to look at the much bigger picture, and that's where the value framework, I think, is important. So yeah, I mean, we need to set carbon targets for sites, really, particularly for development, not so much for schools. I mean, a lot of councils now are including carbon levies for developers who are building buildings for capital usually, and those carbon levies go into paying for sustainable features into schools and other.
Yeah, so in essence, buildings. They're offset, aren't they?
They're effectively offsetting.
Yeah.
But you know, schools are really important hubs of community. Just expanding on what Sharon said earlier, I mean, they are buildings that are occupied for a very short period of time potentially, and actually if you've got this resource and you're trying to keep the building at a temperature, you're better off trying to maximize its use. And you know, it's important to have community buildings that are central functions. So for example, eating, it's much more carbon efficient to feed 300 people than it is for those 300 people to eat individually in their houses. There's a lot less food waste, there's a lot, you know, so you know, and so there's things that we can look at in terms of how we live our lives. And the other thing is, one of our biggest challenges is as we go to a more renewable energy mix, renewable energy is only available when the wind blows and the sun shines. So you need storage hubs for energy, and again, schools could act as stores for their community, so that we can store energy and then release it. So that's another important factor in terms of looking at how we get to zero carbon.
I think as well, Sarah,
the wind blows all the time, so there's no problem with the electricity. Sorry, Steve, you were saying?
Sorry, yeah, I think just very briefly, just to add to that, I'm actually really keen and interested in doing some work at the moment around the sort of carbon offsetting angle, because I simply don't like it really. There's loads of holes in it. You know, you can pay £6 a tonne through the verified carbon standard to offset by planting trees in somewhere around the world. The Committee on Climate Change said the value should be up anything between £6 to £400 per tonne. So there's lots of debate around carbon offsetting, and I think there's a role for schools to play in that. And I'm trying to actively involve local clients in the Liverpool City region and looking at how much carbon they create as a business. Can we engage with schools and offer support to schools to offset through them? So, you know, the average school in the UK emits around 200 tonnes. You know, it's about 30% of that 200 is from the building, 45% is through procurement, and about 15% is from travel. So schools can reduce their own carbon footprint, and I think there's a clever way to look at offsetting locally, and that's something I'm really interested in.
Thank you very much, Steve. Mark, I think this question could be for you. Reem is asking, are life cycle analysis tools effective and realistic?
As with most tools, it depends on the data you're putting in. So I think one of the problems we do have is data, reliable data. You can get different embodied data from different industrial manufacturing bodies that counteract each other. So it is quite difficult as a designer. I think it is getting better. I think there's more organisations that are trying to produce independent data, but it is important. And I think what Steve said earlier about M&E, particularly generally, if you're designing a building with a 100-year life, the M&E is going to be replaced 5 times in that life. So the embodied energy of M&E is quite important, and it sometimes can be the decision between mechanical ventilation and natural ventilation. There's always been this, particularly in schools, this debate which is better, and there's no one can come up with a conclusive answer. But if you do look at it in terms of life cycle costs, there's no doubt that in some scenarios where you don't have a noisy site and all those sorts of things, mechanical ventilation does have a much higher embodied cost.
Thank you very much. Probably it's time to start wrapping things up, because I know you guys are all very, very busy, and we are incredibly grateful for your time. So might be the last question for today, and probably Lee, I would direct that to you. Dylan is asking, what about passive design for schools? How do the panel see the evolution of that in relation to climate change?
Well, by passive, what I understand that to mean, well, passive house, if we talk about that, we are passive house registered. Passive house is actually, all talking about natural ventilation, is actually more about a kind of a hermetically sealed box, which is hyper insulated and hyper airtight with a minimal energy load. You know, a big school can run on a domestic boiler in essence with a passive house system, and then it's about getting the under that system. It's about getting the orientation right. It's about providing classrooms with minimal solar gain. So to get the orientation of a school right in principle first, and then to make sure that the envelope is secure and technically works to a high level, minimizing the input is a big tick. That's what I understand to be that's the way passive design is going, you know, I think. And then to supplement that, as we've been discussing, we need to get the other half of the equation balanced, which is to address the embodied energy in the fundamental materials of the building. That's aside from all of the pedagogical stuff that we've been talking about too, that is equally as important.
Well, thank you very much. Is there any last thoughts anybody want to add, Steve?
Sorry, yeah, I was just going to add, again, sort of very briefly, but on the evolution, I'm again really interested in the evolution of passive design. So we're doing models, conducting models within the university where we're looking at buildings which are super airtight, passive standard today, and we're modeling those buildings in in a post 2050 and 2080 condition. So it then asks the question, which is part of another big debate, is are we going to see a massive demand for air conditioning and cooling when our climate changes, and are our buildings fit for purpose that we're designing today? Are they only fit for purpose for 20 years or 50 years or 80 years? So when we model in the future, and we can do that, scientists do that all the time, we're not really thinking about that at the present time. So that's another thing on evolution of buildings and what we do.
That's an important point, because if you're going to use material to build a building, you want to use the right amount of material. You don't want to use too much material. And if you over insulate things, then that insulation might have been better off in a residential building. So for example, at the moment, if a typical classroom is 60 square meters with 30 kids, just using building regs U values, and only supplying enough fresh air for those people, you are in a cooling situation when the outside air temperature is above 4 degrees. So that puts it into perspective. So for the majority of the year, just with building regs, forget passive house, 4 degrees outside and above, you need to cool the building. So that's the issue. But the idea of passive house really is about not having any heating whatsoever and letting the people heat the building. And the trick is to try and keep the heat in the building overnight, and that's when you lose it. And that's what drives it. But if you keep people using the building for longer periods, then that sort of issue goes away a little bit. So it is about maximizing use, because if people are in your building, in the school building, they're not elsewhere using energy. It's more efficient for them to use it in a
it's more than a school, then it's a community, it's an extended community asset, isn't it? Which I think is what Sharon was saying too.
So through a changing climate, are we shifting carbon just from one form to another? Are we going to move it all from operational to embodied? If there's a massive need for solar panels and air source heat pumps and air conditioning units, are we shifting that balance? So that's again another really large area that I'm involved with, writing research papers on those topics and things like that. So yeah, this isn't the end of the debate, it's just the start really.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for this. It was incredibly interesting, and by looking at the number of questions, we had the most successful panel so far. So thank you again. You did a fantastic job. It was incredibly good to listen to. Obviously, thanks to Domus, our sponsor that keeps supporting us in all these initiatives and virtual events. We are back in February. We're taking a long break for Christmas because we are a bit knackered. So we're back in February. We'll be talking about the future of workplace. So if you want to listen to this webinar again or share it with your colleagues, the recording will be made available later on today or tomorrow at the latest. And you should automatically receive the information on your email. So that's all from us. Merry Christmas to everybody. I hope you're having a very joyful break despite coronavirus and everything else. So thanks again and see you later. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.